The sun was dipping behind the rugged peaks, casting long shadows across the dense forest below. Eric and Jack had been hiking for hours, their muscles sore and their breath labored as they trudged along the narrow trail deep in the mountains. What had started as a spontaneous weekend adventure had turned into a grueling trek with no clear destination. "We need to find a place to set up camp," Jack muttered, wiping the sweat from his brow as he glanced at the dimming sky. "It's getting dark." Eric nodded, checking the map once again. According to it, they were still several miles from the nearest marked campsite. But as he lowered the map, something caught his eye. Nestled between the trees, barely visible through the thickening mist, was a structure, an old cabin, weathered and worn, its wooden frame leaning slightly as if the forest itself had begun to swallow it whole. "That's not on the map," Eric said, furrowing his brow. Jack followed his gaze and shrugged. "Looks abandoned. Maybe we could crash there for the night instead of pitching a tent. Better than sleeping in the cold." They exchanged a look of silent agreement. The promise of a roof over their heads, no matter how decrepit, was far more appealing than another night in their cramped tent. They made their way off the trail, pushing through the underbrush until they stood in front of the mysterious cabin. The door hung slightly ajar, creaking as it swayed in the breeze. Eric felt a chill run down his spine, though the air wasn't particularly cold. The cabin's windows were dark, and the air around it seemed unnaturally still. "Doesn't look like anyone's been here for a long time," Jack said, peering inside. "It's perfect." Eric hesitated for a moment before stepping through the doorway. Inside, the cabin was as dilapidated as it appeared from the outside. The furniture was sparse, just an old table and two wooden chairs, a fireplace filled with ash, and cobwebs hanging in the corners like ghostly veils. But it was dry, and the walls would keep the wind at bay. They unpacked their gear and started a small fire in the fireplace, the crackling flames pushing back the growing darkness. As they ate their meager dinner in silence, the sense of unease that had crept up on Eric earlier refused to leave him. There was something wrong about the cabin. Something off. "Doesn't it feel weird to you?" Eric asked finally, breaking the silence. Jack looked up from his food, raising an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "I don't know. This place, it doesn't feel right. It's like it's been waiting for us or something." Jack chuckled, shaking his head. "You've been reading too many horror stories, man. It's just an old cabin in the woods. Perfectly normal." But as the firelight flickered across the room, casting long shadows on the walls, Eric couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. And then came the first knock. It was soft at first, almost imperceptible. A gentle tap, tap, tap on the wooden door. Eric froze, his eyes darting toward the door. Jack frowned, setting his food aside. "Did you hear that?" Eric whispered. "Yeah. Probably just the wind," Jack said, though his voice betrayed a hint of uncertainty. The knocking continued, growing louder and more deliberate. It wasn't the wind. It couldn't be. Without a word, Jack got to his feet and crossed the room, his hand hovering near the door handle. Eric stood as well, every muscle tense, his heart pounding in his chest. "Who's there?" Jack called out, his voice firm but cautious. No answer. The knocking stopped abruptly, replaced by a heavy silence that pressed in around them. Eric felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. Then, from somewhere outside, just beyond the door, came a soft whisper. A voice, barely audible, carried by the wind. Let us in. Jack jerked back from the door, his face pale. What the hell? Eric moved closer to the door, his pulse racing. We should leave, he said quietly. There's something out there. Jack nodded slowly, his earlier bravado gone. But as they turned to gather their things, the knocking started again. Louder this time. More insistent. The whispers grew, swirling around the cabin like a living thing. Eric glanced at Jack, his eyes wide with fear. Whatever was outside wanted in. And they were trapped inside, with nowhere to run. The cabin felt smaller now, the once comforting crackle of the fire reduced to mere embers as the eerie whispers swirled outside. Eric's hands trembled as he stuffed gear back into his bag. Jack was already pacing, his eyes fixed on the door, the knocking reverberating through the thin wooden walls. We can't stay here, man, Eric hissed, his voice barely more than a whisper. Whatever that is out there, it's not human. Jack didn't respond. His mind seemed to be elsewhere, eyes glazed as the insistent knocks echoed through the room. Eric grabbed his arm, shaking him out of his daze. Jack, come on. We need to leave, now. Jack blinked, looking at Eric as if seeing him for the first time. Leave? How? It's pitch black out there. And those things, they'll get us. Before Eric could respond, a loud crash came from behind them. Both men whirled around, eyes darting toward the small, fogged-up window beside the door. It had shattered, glass littering the floor beneath it. A cold wind howled through the opening, bringing with it the sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, and far too close for comfort. They're coming, Jack muttered, his voice barely audible. Without thinking, Eric grabbed the iron poker from beside the fireplace, holding it in front of him like a makeshift weapon. The footsteps circled the cabin now, growing louder, moving faster, as if they were being taunted. Then the whispers returned, louder, clearer this time. Open the door, let us in. Eric's heart raced. They're just trying to scare us. They want us to open the door. Jack swallowed hard, grabbing his own gear and hoisting it over his shoulder. If we stay here, we're dead. We make a run for it, now. The two exchanged a glance, a silent agreement that they would rather face the dark wilderness than whatever was creeping outside the cabin. They grabbed their bags and moved toward the door, muscles tensed and ready to bolt. But just as Eric reached for the handle, the door rattled violently. The knocking had turned into pounding, the force behind it so strong the wood buckled inward. Jack stepped back in horror as the door shook on its hinges. There's no way we're going out there, Jack exclaimed, his voice a desperate mix of fear and frustration. We'll never make it. The pounding stopped as suddenly as it had started, replaced by the ominous sound of something scratching at the walls, like claws dragging across the rotting wood, circling them. Eric's breathing quickened as he backed away from the door, his eyes scanning the room for another way out. There's gotta be another exit, he said, frantically searching the walls. A back door, a window, something. Jack shook his head, his face pale. We checked. There's only the front door. The cabin creaked under the weight of the wind, the old beams groaning as if they too were being squeezed by the invisible presence outside. Then, just when the tension felt unbearable, the whispers came again, this time right at their ears, as if the voices had seeped through the very walls of the cabin. Let us in, Eric snapped. He lunged toward the door, flinging it open, the cold night air rushing into the cabin. But there was no one there. No figures waiting to pounce. Just the thick fog curling through the trees, obscuring everything beyond the porch. What the hell, Eric whispered, stepping cautiously outside, gripping the iron poker tightly. Jack followed, his flashlight flickering weakly as he shone it into the mist. "We can't see anything out here. We'll get lost." Eric's mind raced as he scanned the surroundings. There was no movement, no sound except for the wind whistling through the trees. For a brief moment, he thought maybe they had imagined it all. But then he saw them, the footprints. The ground around the cabin was soft from recent rain, and there, imprinted in the mud, were dozens of footprints. Fresh. Human. And they were circling the cabin in perfect, deliberate loops. Eric's heart sank. "There's no way anyone could walk around the cabin that fast," Jack muttered, his voice shaky as he stared at the tracks. Suddenly, the air around them grew colder, as if the temperature had dropped by several degrees in an instant. Eric's breath came out in short, visible puffs. The fog thickened, swallowing the trees, and for the first time, they realized just how far they were from civilization. The whispers returned, but this time they weren't soft. They weren't distant. They were right behind them. "Run!" Eric shouted. The two bolted back into the cabin, slamming the door shut behind them, their hearts pounding as the voices swelled, growing louder, more insistent. Eric braced himself against the door, holding it closed as the pounding returned, harder and more furious than before. Jack grabbed the fireplace poker, standing ready beside him, but the fear in his eyes told Eric that neither of them was ready for what was coming. As the whispers closed in and the cabin shook under the relentless assault from outside, both men knew they had made a terrible mistake. They had found a cabin that should never have been there. And now, it wasn't letting them leave. The pounding at the door became deafening. Each hit rattled the cabin like a drum being beaten by some unseen force, shaking the walls, threatening to splinter the fragile wood. Jack was pale, gripping the iron poker so tightly his knuckles were white, but his eyes darted between the door and the window, desperation written across his face. Eric strained against the door, sweat pouring down his forehead as it rattled under the pressure. The whispers had transformed into a low, guttural growl, surrounding them, filling every corner of the room with an eerie presence that made their skin crawl. "We can't hold it off forever," Jack shouted, his voice barely rising above the cacophony of sound. "We need a plan." Eric's mind raced. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to get as far away from the cabin as possible, but where could they go? The fog outside was too thick, and those footprints, they weren't alone out here. Something, or many things, were circling them like predators. "We can't leave," Eric snapped, his voice trembling with fear. "We don't know what's out there." As if responding to his words, the door creaked violently, the wood groaning as if it might give way at any second. Then, without warning, the pounding stopped. Silence fell, thick and oppressive. The only sound was the rapid beating of their hearts, echoing in the sudden stillness. "What just happened?" Jack asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. Eric didn't move from the door. His muscles were tense, every fiber of his being screaming that this wasn't over. He motioned for Jack to stay quiet, but in that moment, something shifted. A shadow passed across the window, a tall, distorted silhouette, barely visible through the mist. "Did you see that?" Jack whispered, stepping back toward the window. Eric's breath hitched. He had seen it, too, though he wished he hadn't. The figure had moved inhumanly fast, almost as if it had been standing still, watching them, before vanishing in the fog. The air grew heavier, colder, as if they were being suffocated by the very atmosphere around them. Then, the sound came again. Tap. 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 Not the frantic pounding from before, but a soft, deliberate tapping on the window this time. Jack froze, his body rigid as he stared at the glass, where a small, pale handprint began to form. It wasn't a smudge, it was fresh, slowly pressing against the window from the outside. Jack stumbled backward, his eyes wide with terror. "Eric, what the hell is that?" Eric couldn't answer. His throat felt dry, as though the air had been sucked out of the room. The handprint remained for a moment longer, then slid down the glass, leaving a streak behind it before disappearing entirely. "We have to get out of here," Eric finally whispered, pushing away from the door. Now, Jack didn't need convincing. He grabbed their gear, and they rushed to the back of the cabin, searching for any exit, any window they hadn't noticed before. But the cabin was small, claustrophobic. The only way out was the front door, the same one they had just barricaded. As they stumbled through the cramped space, Jack's flashlight flickered, casting long shadows against the walls. Something about the cabin was changing. The room felt different, as though it had shifted slightly, the angles of the walls no longer right, the ceiling seeming to press down on them. "Was this here before?" Jack asked suddenly, stopping in front of a door they hadn't noticed earlier. It was small, nearly hidden in the far corner of the room, behind the dust and cobwebs that clung to the walls. It didn't make sense. They had searched the cabin earlier. There had been no door. "No," Eric muttered, shaking his head. "That wasn't there." Without thinking, Jack grabbed the handle and pulled the door open. A gust of cold air rushed out, as though the cabin itself had been holding its breath. Beyond the door was a narrow staircase, descending into darkness. It shouldn't have been there. The cabin was too small to have a basement. "We don't have time to think about this," Jack said, his voice panicked. "We have to go. Whatever's up here is worse." Eric hesitated, every instinct telling him that going down those stairs was a terrible idea. But the sounds outside the cabin were returning, the whispers, the growls, the unmistakable presence of something circling, closing in on them again. They didn't have a choice. "We'll go down," Eric agreed, swallowing his fear. "But stay close." The stairs creaked ominously beneath their feet as they descended, the air growing colder with each step. The flashlight's weak beam barely illuminated the narrow passage, but as they reached the bottom, they found themselves standing in a small room, not much bigger than the one above. The walls were made of rough stone, slick with moisture, and the floor was covered in dirt. In the center of the room stood an old, rusted metal door. Unlike the rest of the cabin, this looked solid, imposing. Eric's stomach churned as he approached it, the faintest hint of a whisper brushing against his ears. "Don't open it," the voice hissed. Eric froze, his hand inches from the door handle. His body screamed at him to turn back, to leave this place, but before he could say anything, Jack reached past him, gripping the handle and pulling it open. The door swung inward with a groan, revealing nothing but pitch-black darkness beyond. Then came the scream. It wasn't from outside the cabin. It wasn't a part of the whispers or the pounding that had terrified them earlier. It was from inside the room, echoing out of the darkness in front of them, a long, drawn-out wail that made the blood in their veins turn to ice. And it was getting closer. The scream continued, reverberating off the stone walls, pulling Eric and Jack into a suffocating grip of terror. It was a sound neither of them could comprehend, a human voice, yet distorted, warped beyond recognition, as if it had been trapped for an eternity in the dark. "Shut it! Shut the door!" Eric yelled, stumbling back. His legs felt weak, and the room spun around him. Jack, frozen in place, stood at the threshold of the gaping doorway, his hand still gripping the cold metal handle. "Jack!" Eric's voice broke through the fog of fear. "Close the damn door!" Jack blinked, as though snapping out of a trance, and slammed the door shut with all his strength. The rusted hinges screeched, and the heavy metal door clanged shut, the noise echoing in the tiny stone room. For a moment, everything was still. The screaming had stopped. Silence hung heavy in the air. Panting, Jack leaned against the door, trying to catch his breath. "What the hell was that?" he gasped between breaths. "I don't know," Eric whispered, his voice trembling. "But we need to get out of here, fast." They scrambled up the stairs, their feet pounding on the old wood as they raced back to the main cabin. The oppressive feeling had only grown thicker, as if the very walls were closing in on them, shifting with every move they made. As they burst into the main room, the cabin had changed again. The furniture, once dusty and rotted, was now positioned neatly, as though someone had recently lived there. An old rocking chair creaked gently by the window, moving back and forth without anyone sitting in it. The fire in the hearth that had long since died was now crackling with fresh flames. "This can't be real," Jack muttered, his eyes wide as he took in the impossible scene. We were just here, and it didn't look like this." Eric's heart pounded in his chest. "We need to leave. Now." He reached for the front door, fumbling with the latch. But as he did, the floor beneath their feet began to vibrate, a low hum building beneath them. The walls of the cabin seemed to ripple, as though the entire structure was breathing, alive in some horrible, unnatural way. Suddenly, the front door flung itself open, slamming against the wall with a force that made both men jump. The cold night air rushed in, along with the thick fog that clung to the mountain outside. But standing just outside the doorway was someone. A figure. Tall, cloaked in shadow, barely visible through the mist, yet undeniably there. The same figure they had glimpsed earlier through the window, now standing only feet away. "Eric," Jack's voice was a strangled whisper. "Do you see that?" Eric nodded, his throat too tight to speak. The figure didn't move. It simply stood there, watching them, as if waiting for something. Then, without warning, the figure took a step forward. "No!" Eric shouted, grabbing Jack's arm and pulling him back into the cabin. The door slammed shut behind them, locking them in once again. But it didn't matter, the figure was no longer outside. It was inside. The shadows in the corner of the room seemed to stretch and shift, coalescing into the shape of a person, a tall, faceless silhouette that loomed over them, silent and still. Eric's breath came in ragged gasps as he backed away, pulling Jack with him. "We need to get out. There has to be another way." His voice trembled with panic as the shadow moved, slowly gliding across the floor towards them, silent as death. Jack, his mind racing, grabbed the lantern from the table and swung it at the shadow. The light passed through the figure as though it wasn't there, but the lantern shattered against the floor, igniting a small flame on the wooden boards. "We have to go out the back," Jack shouted, but as he turned, the cabin itself seemed to shift, the walls groaning and moving, blocking their path. The back door, once clearly visible, was now gone, swallowed by the changing layout of the cabin. Trapped. The flames from the lantern flickered across the room, casting long shadows against the walls. Eric's eyes darted around, searching for any escape. The windows? No, they were too small, too narrow to crawl through. The staircase leading to the mysterious basement? No way in hell. Then he saw it. A hatch in the ceiling, an attic, maybe hidden in the dark corners of the cabin's roof. "There," Eric pointed. "The attic. We can climb up and break through the roof." Jack didn't need convincing. They grabbed a chair, propping it under the hatch, and Eric clambered up first, his heart racing as he shoved the old wooden door open. Dust and cobwebs filled his mouth and eyes, but he pushed through, pulling himself into the small, cramped attic space. The air up here was cold, stifling, as if the attic hadn't been touched in decades. Old furniture and crates filled the room, and the roof was low, forcing them to crouch. "Hurry!" Jack hissed from below as he climbed up after Eric, just as the shadow reached the base of the chair, its long, dark arms stretching upwards. Eric slammed the hatch shut, his heart hammering in his chest. "That won't hold it for long. We need to break through the roof." Jack whispered urgently, already looking for anything to break through the wooden beams above them. But as Eric took a step forward, his foot collided with something. Something metal, hidden beneath a dusty old blanket in the corner of the attic. "What's this?" he muttered, pulling back the blanket to reveal a large, rusted iron chest, old and battered but strangely out of place. Jack looked over, his face pale. "That doesn't look like it belongs here." Before either of them could react, the chest rattled violently, shaking against the floorboards as if something inside was trying to escape. The hatch beneath them began to creak, the shadow clawing at the wood, inching closer. "We don't have time for this," Eric hissed, but his eyes were drawn to the chest. Something about it was wrong. Deeply wrong. And whatever it was, it seemed connected to the nightmare unfolding around them. Suddenly, the hatch below them snapped open, the shadow spilling into the attic like an inky tide, rushing toward them. "Eric, the roof!" Jack shouted, scrambling to break through the beams. But Eric was frozen, staring at the chest as it rattled and shook, a deep, malevolent energy emanating from within. Then, without thinking, Eric reached down, gripped the handle of the chest, and pulled it open. As Eric pried the chest open, an overwhelming stench of decay and rot hit him like a wall. The air seemed to grow colder, as if something ancient and evil had been disturbed. Inside the chest lay a single object, a book. Its cover was cracked leather, the pages brittle and yellowed with age, but it radiated a palpable energy, dark and pulsing, as though it was alive. Jack, still struggling to break through the roof, glanced back at Eric. "What the hell are you doing? We need to get out of here." But Eric couldn't tear his eyes away from the book. His fingers tingled as he reached out and touched it, the leather cold beneath his hand. A whisper seemed to echo from within the pages, soft, indistinct, but unmistakably sinister. His breath caught in his throat. "Eric!" Jack's voice snapped him back to reality. The shadow, now fully inside the attic, slithered across the floor, moving faster, almost as if drawn to the chest and the book. Eric grabbed the book and slammed the chest shut, but it was too late. The moment the chest closed, the shadow surged forward with violent speed, enveloping the room in darkness. Jack screamed, swinging wildly at the air, but it was useless. The shadow was everywhere and nowhere at once, suffocating them with its presence. In the chaos, Eric stumbled backward, clutching the book to his chest, his mind racing. The cabin, the shadow, the book, they were all connected. This thing, whatever it was, had been trapped, buried in the past, waiting for someone to release it. But now, it was awake. Suddenly, the walls of the attic began to close in, the ceiling groaning as the entire cabin seemed to twist and shift again. The floorboards under their feet buckled, and the furniture that had been hidden in the corners began to move on its own, shifting towards them as though possessed. "We're not going to make it!" Jack shouted, his voice high with panic. He slammed his fists against the roof, desperate to break through, but the wood wouldn't budge. Eric's heart pounded in his chest as he realized what had to be done. The book. It was the key to everything. He didn't understand how or why, but he knew if they didn't destroy it, they'd never get out of this place alive. "We have to burn it," Eric shouted, holding the book up. Jack turned to him, his face pale and slick with sweat. "What? Burn what?" "The book." Eric's voice cracked with desperation. It's the only way. But before they could act, the shadow surged again, slamming into Jack with a force that knocked him across the attic. His body collided with a wooden beam, and he crumpled to the floor, unconscious. No! Eric screamed, rushing to his friend's side. But the shadow wasn't done. It began to writhe and twist, its form changing, growing taller, more defined. What had once been an indistinct blur of darkness was now taking on the shape of something horrifyingly human. Eric could see it now, eyes hollow and glowing, and a mouth twisted in a grotesque grin. It stood over Jack, its long, bony fingers reaching out, ready to consume him. Without thinking, Eric grabbed the book and tore at its pages, ripping them apart with frantic energy. Each page he destroyed seemed to make the shadow recoil slightly, its form flickering, as though the book was its anchor to this world. But the shadow fought back. A sharp, icy pain shot through Eric's chest as the creature lunged at him, its fingers slicing through the air. He screamed as the coldness gripped him, freezing his limbs, but he refused to let go of the book. Desperately, he reached into his pocket, fumbling for the lighter he'd carried with him for the trip. His fingers trembled as he flipped it open, the small flame flickering in the darkness. With a final, guttural scream, Eric set the flame to the torn pages. The book caught fire immediately, the flames dancing across the pages as if the paper had been soaked in oil. The shadow screeched, a horrible, otherworldly sound that echoed through the attic, vibrating in Eric's skull. It writhed, twisting violently, its form becoming less and less solid with every passing second. But the cabin, too, was reacting. The walls groaned and shook violently, as though the structure was coming apart at the seams. The floorboards beneath them splintered, the roof began to cave in, and the air filled with the acrid smell of burning wood and old, foul decay. Eric dragged Jack's limp body away from the collapsing attic, the fire from the book now spreading to the beams above them. He could feel the heat on his skin, the flames licking at his heels as he pulled Jack towards the shattered remains of the attic door. But even as the shadow dissolved into the air, the cabin continued to shake, as if the entire place was falling into some dark, forgotten void. With one final surge of strength, Eric hurled himself and Jack down through the hatch, tumbling down into the main floor of the cabin. They crashed onto the ground below, dazed but alive. Above them, the attic burned furiously, the flames consuming everything in their path. But the cabin hadn't stopped changing. As the fire roared above, the floor beneath them began to open up, revealing a pit, black and bottomless, swallowing the wooden boards piece by piece. Eric scrambled to his feet, dragging Jack with him as the pit grew larger, threatening to consume them both. "We have to move. Now!" Eric shouted, shaking Jack awake. Jack groaned, his eyes fluttering open. "What's happening?" he mumbled weakly. "No time. We need to get out before this place collapses." Together, they stumbled toward the front door, dodging falling beams and burning debris. The air was thick with smoke, and the roar of the fire was deafening. Eric's lungs burned, his vision blurred by the heat and ash, but he pushed forward, driven by pure survival instinct. They reached the door just as the ground behind them gave way entirely, the cabin collapsing into itself like a dying beast. Without looking back, they ran into the fog-drenched night, the cold air hitting them like a slap to the face. The cabin let out one final, thunderous groan as it sank completely into the earth, leaving nothing but a smoking crater behind. Eric and Jack stumbled through the dense forest, the cool night air biting at their skin as the ground trembled beneath them. Behind them, the smoking crater where the cabin once stood still glowed faintly, an eerie reminder of what they had barely escaped. But they weren't safe yet. Eric's chest heaved as he struggled to catch his breath, the adrenaline still surging through his veins. Jack, limping beside him, winced with each step, but neither of them dared to stop. The forest had changed. What was once an open trail now felt suffocating, as if the trees themselves were closing in on them. Where are we going? Jack panted, glancing back at the smoldering ruins in the distance. We're still lost. Eric didn't respond immediately. His eyes were locked on the path ahead, or rather, the lack of one. The trail they had followed into the forest had completely vanished, replaced by gnarled roots and twisted branches that seemed to rise up from the earth like skeletal fingers. Every step felt wrong, as though the forest was shifting, reshaping itself to trap them. We need to keep moving, Eric finally muttered, his voice strained. We need to get away from whatever that was. Jack stumbled over a root, nearly falling face first into the dirt, but Eric caught him just in time. Are you okay? He asked, his concern barely masking the fear gnawing at him. Jack nodded, though his face was pale, and his eyes darted nervously around the darkened woods. I think I twisted my ankle when it hit me. His voice trailed off, the memory of the shadow still fresh in his mind. But there was no time to dwell on the past. The woods were too silent, unnaturally so. No wind rustled the leaves, no animals scurried through the underbrush. It was as though the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Then they heard it, a faint whisper carried on the wind. Eric froze, his heart leaping into his throat. Jack's eyes widened as the whisper grew louder, more insistent, as if 100 voices were murmuring all around them. Did you hear that? Jack whispered, his voice trembling. Eric nodded, his grip tightening on Jack's arm. The whispers seemed to come from everywhere at once, circling them, taunting them. And then, without warning, a cold wind gusted through the trees, carrying with it the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Someone, or something, was following them. We need to move faster, Eric hissed, pulling Jack along as they stumbled through the underbrush. The footsteps grew louder, quicker, matching their frantic pace. Eric's pulse pounded in his ears as he pushed through the thick branches, feeling as though the forest itself was closing in on them. Suddenly, Jack let out a sharp cry, collapsing to the ground as his twisted ankle gave way. Eric spun around, grabbing him by the shoulders and hauling him back to his feet. Come on, we can't stop, Eric urged, his voice tight with panic. But Jack shook his head, his face twisted in pain. I can't run anymore. My leg. A branch snapped behind them, and both men whipped around, their blood running cold. Through the mist, they saw it, the shadow. It had returned, but this time, it was different. Taller, more defined. No longer a mere blur of darkness, it stood at the edge of the clearing, its hollow eyes fixed on them. Its mouth twisted into a grotesque smile, wide and jagged, as if mocking their desperation. Eric's stomach lurched. He had burned the book. He had destroyed it. How could the shadow still be here? Eric, Jack whispered, his voice barely audible, it's coming. Eric glanced at his friend, the weight of the situation crashing down on him. They couldn't run. They couldn't hide. And whatever this thing was, it wasn't going to stop until it had them. Desperation clawed at Eric's mind as he scanned their surroundings, searching for anything, any way out. His eyes fell on a cluster of rocks just ahead, partially hidden by the thick fog. It wasn't much, but it could offer some temporary cover. Over there! Eric pointed, pulling Jack to his feet and dragging him toward the rocks. The shadow, sensing their movement, let out a low, guttural sound, a sound that sent a shiver down Eric's spine. They reached the rocks and crouched behind them, their backs pressed against the cold stone. Eric could hear his own heartbeat, loud and frantic, as the shadow's footsteps approached. Each step was deliberate, slow, as if it knew they had nowhere left to go. The whispers returned, louder this time, filling the air around them. Eric covered his ears, trying to block out the sound, but it was useless. The voices were inside his head now, crawling through his thoughts like a disease. I don't understand, Jack whimpered, his voice barely a whisper. Why is this happening? Eric shook his head, unable to answer. The whispers seemed to be speaking directly to him now, their words laced with malice. He couldn't make out everything, but one phrase kept repeating itself over and over again. "You never should have opened it." Eric's breath hitched. The book. He had unleashed something that was never meant to be disturbed. And now, it was coming for them. The shadow loomed closer, its form growing darker and more solid with each passing second. It didn't walk, it glided, as though it wasn't bound by the same laws of nature that govern the living. Eric's heart raced as the creature stopped just a few feet from their hiding spot, its hollow eyes scanning the rocks. For a moment, everything was still. Eric barely breathed, his muscles tense, waiting for the inevitable. But then, the shadow moved on, disappearing into the mist once more. Eric exhaled shakily, his entire body trembling with fear. "We need to go now," he whispered to Jack. But as they stood to leave, the ground beneath them began to rumble. A deep, resonant sound echoed through the forest, shaking the trees and sending a fresh wave of terror through them both. And then they saw it. Ahead, just beyond the rocks, the earth began to split open, revealing a gaping chasm that seemed to stretch into the depths of the earth. From its dark maw, the whispers grew louder, more chaotic, like the voices of countless souls trapped within the void. Something was emerging, something far worse than the shadow. Eric's blood ran cold as a massive, serpentine form began to rise from the chasm, its scales slick and black, its eyes glowing with an ancient, malevolent intelligence. It was something out of a nightmare, a creature that defied reason and reality. "Run," Eric whispered, his voice barely audible. "Run!" Eric and Jack sprinted through the forest, their legs fueled by pure terror as the colossal creature emerged fully from the gaping chasm. The ground continued to tremble beneath their feet, and the oppressive air seemed to thicken, pressing down on them as though the forest itself was collapsing. Behind them, the serpentine horror let out a low, resonant growl, shaking the trees and filling the air with a putrid stench of decay. Eric's mind was racing. He couldn't comprehend what was happening. This was beyond anything rational, beyond anything that should have existed. And yet, it was real. Too real. His heart pounded against his ribcage as he darted through the twisted branches, half dragging Jack, who stumbled beside him, still limping from his injured ankle. The creature's glowing eyes seemed to follow them, even through the mist, locking onto their very souls. Its presence was suffocating, an all-consuming darkness that erased any hope of escape. "There!" Eric shouted, spotting a faint opening in the distance, a break in the dense trees. He pulled Jack toward it, desperation surging through him like fire. The creature was gaining on them, its massive form moving with an unnatural speed for something so large. They burst through the trees and stumbled into an open clearing, the moonlight casting an eerie glow over the space. Eric stopped, gasping for breath as Jack collapsed to the ground beside him. The clearing was silent, the oppressive whispers momentarily gone, but the weight of the creature's presence still lingered like a storm on the horizon. Are we safe?" Jack wheezed, clutching his side as he struggled to breathe. Eric didn't answer. He couldn't. His mind was too consumed by what had just transpired, by the sheer impossibility of what they had encountered. But he knew one thing for certain, they weren't safe. Not yet. And then he saw it. In the middle of the clearing, where there should have been nothing but grass and trees, stood the cabin. The very same cabin they had fled from hours ago. It was intact, as if it had never been destroyed, the door hanging slightly ajar, inviting them in once again. Eric's blood turned to ice. That's impossible," he whispered, taking a step back. "It was destroyed. We saw it." Jack's eyes widened in disbelief as he followed Eric's gaze. No, he muttered, shaking his head violently. "This can't be real. It can't be." But the cabin was there, solid and tangible, standing as if it had always been. The air around them grew colder, and the oppressive whispers began to return, soft at first, then rising to a deafening crescendo. The voices seemed to swirl around them, growing louder and more chaotic, filling the space with a sense of impending doom. "You never should have opened it." Eric's breath caught in his throat. The book, the damned book. He had burned it, destroyed it, but whatever had been unleashed was far beyond the book. It had already been here, waiting, and they had merely triggered something ancient, something that had been lying in wait for centuries. The ground beneath their feet began to tremble again, more violently this time. The creature was coming, and there was no escaping it. Eric's eyes darted to the cabin, and though every instinct screamed at him to run, to flee, something in him knew there was only one place left to go. "We need to go inside," Eric said, his voice barely above a whisper. Jack stared at him, horrified. "Are you insane?" "That's where it all started." Eric shook his head, his face pale. "It doesn't matter. It's coming for us. We have no choice." The creature's guttural growl echoed through the clearing, closer now, and the ground shook violently beneath their feet. Eric didn't wait for Jack to respond. He grabbed his friend by the arm and pulled him toward the cabin. They crossed the threshold, and the moment they stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind them with a deafening thud. Inside, the air was thick and oppressive, the dim light from the outside barely penetrating the gloom. The whispers were louder now, pressing against their minds like a tangible force. Eric's pulse raced as he scanned the room, looking for anything that could save them. His eyes fell on the old wooden table in the center of the room, and there, sitting atop it, was the book. The very same one he had burned, its pages pristine and whole, as though it had never been touched by flame. Eric's stomach churned. "No, this isn't real. This can't be real." Jack backed away, his eyes wide with terror. "Don't touch it. Don't you dare touch it." But Eric was already moving toward the book, something deep inside him pulling him closer. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, as though the very walls of the cabin were alive, feeding off their fear. His hand trembled as he reached for the book, but before he could lay a finger on it, the cabin shook violently, and the door burst open with a loud crash. The creature was here. It filled the doorway, its massive form blocking out the light, its glowing eyes locking onto them with a predatory hunger. The air grew colder, the shadows deepening, as the creature slithered into the room, its dark form merging with the walls, the floor, the very fabric of the cabin itself. Eric and Jack backed away, trapped, the monstrous figure looming over them. The whispers became a roar, deafening, chaotic, until Eric could no longer think, no longer breathe. The creature's eyes locked onto his, and in that moment, he understood. It wasn't the book that was the source of the evil, it was the cabin. It had been a trap, luring them in from the very beginning. Eric's heart pounded in his chest as the creature closed in on them, its shadowy form enveloping the room. There was no escape. They had opened the door, and now it was time to pay the price. The last thing Eric saw before the darkness consumed them was the cabin's door, standing wide open, the endless forest beyond it, silent and waiting for the next traveler to stumble across it. And then, there was only the dark.